Well, certainly glad everyone's here tonight. Going to get a little drink of water here. Well, I can't believe that we're on lesson 48. We only have 2 more to go, and then we'll start over. September 20th, you might want to jot that down. September 20th, we're going to have a special night here. We're going to have pizza. We talked about the barbecue and all that stuff, but for sake of time and mess and everything, we're just going to get a bunch of pizzas and salad and that. But we're also going to, a few of you have agreed to give a short testimony about what you've learned and stuff, and the rest that want to will have a time to do like popcorn testimonies where you can just share. I'm going to give out little certificates for people that have been here the 1 year, the 2 year, the 10 years. I think Bill gets a 15 year, but D's up there, I know. But anyway, so kind of think of how long you've been here, whether it's been at another church or here or whatever, and I'd like to celebrate that with you and praise God for what He's done. And we'll look forward. And so if you want, invite people, no strings attached. They don't have to ever come back, when it's not a hook, but if you want to invite someone that's maybe been a good friend that's supported you during this class, and prayed for you, thought about you, invite them. If you think some people might benefit from something like this, tell them to come and get a taste of it that night. Well, we'll probably have a praise band. We're working on that now, just where we sing a little bit. And so it's going to be nice. And then the 27th, we're starting fresh from, right in the beginning again. So looking forward to the new year and what's going to happen. So tonight on your table, you've got the daily devotions and exercises. And again, I say this every week, the devotions are just real short, but they usually kind of, if you don't have anything else you read in the morning, a lot of times it's good to start your day with a little thought, inspiration, and a prayer. And on some of these, I even have it like an affirmation. And then the exercises, and here again, I suggest evening, but obviously you can do that in the morning or whenever too. But each one has something else to do, like return to joys and the same. Rewrite your child talk. What's that mean? That would be kind of interesting. But they're usually geared on some of the principles we teach in here. And renew your day and bring closure. Did I feel angry today? Did I feel just some good exercises? And some of them may hit with you, and you'll say, gee, I should do this more often, and keep those and do it. So we put a lot into that because this is a year-long class, and if you can add some of the exercises as you go along, it just really helps cement in some of the principles that we teach, because it's about emotional resilience, right? The ability to bounce back, the ability to continue. And so tonight we're on the second part of emotional relearning. So why don't we just open in prayer and we'll get started. So Father, I thank you, Lord, for bringing us here tonight. Thank you for those that are watching, Lord, on the air. And Father, I thank you for what you're going to do tonight. Open our hearts to hear, Lord, of maybe what needs to be corrected. What kind of thinking are we doing? Lord, just open our minds that we might hear some things tonight and start to make these little nudges forward. And so, Father, we'll thank you for what you're going to do. In your name, amen. Those of you watching online, if you don't have the notes, you can email me, ron@empowerministry.org. That's ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send them to you and put you on the mailing list. That way you'll get them each week. So we're talking about the last part, emotional relearning. We started off talking about recognizing, if we're going to be resilient, we need to realize when we're off the reservation, right? Usually it's afterwards. Oh, man, why did I say that? Gee, boy, did I get mad. Oh, man, that just broke my heart, and we're reflecting on it. We're thinking about it, and that's okay. At least we're thinking about it, right? And we can make corrections at that time. But wouldn't it be good if we could start to recognize that when we get triggered, that something's going on in our body, in our mind, we're feeling, if we can get that cue, then we can start to regulate. we can start to bring it down. Because what's happening at that point is if this is your brain, right, you got your prefrontal cortex. In there, you've got the limbic series, right? We've talked about this, and the amygdala and hippocampus. And what happens is that amygdala gets triggered, and it just hijacks the brain, right? And there's no communication between the rational part of the brain. That's why, it was interesting, some studies done, and I've only realized this in the last year or so, but a lot of times when we're triggered, and especially when it comes to substance and things like that, and we're craving, a lot of times we'll be going into the experience, and then later we're going, wow, why did I do that? And it's almost as if we're just kind of getting out of our body in a sense. We're going along and like in a daydream state, and we're just kind of going along with it, and that prefrontal cortex isn't even online. We're just doing it. And I've had people tell me, said, yeah, I quit smoking. Next thing I knew, I had a cigarette in my hand. And they were really kind of shocked by it, And people says, yeah, I quit drinking, and all of a sudden I'm there with my buddies, and I got a beer in my hand, And they were half serious. And a lot of times that's how it goes. I mean, we get at home, and we're so habitual a lot of times. And I've had guys say the same thing about porn and things like that. I intended not to do it, wasn't going to do it. Well, like that, the similar mechanisms happen in the brain when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to depression, when it comes to some of these other emotions that we have. A lot of times they're triggered, and all of a sudden we start going down the road. And so if we can regulate it, if we can breathe and do some of the things that we can do to regulate the emotions, then all of a sudden that prefrontal cortex can come back online, and we can start to slow down, think it through. And then eventually what we want to do is, what triggered us in the first place? What in the world was the thoughts, the beliefs, the consequences that we dreaded, some kind of prediction that our brain was making that caused us to be anxious in the first place, that caused us to have that depressive mode, or to start to use again. And if we can start to figure out some of that stuff, we can replace those lies, because the good news is the majority of the things that upset us are lies. They come out of childhood, when we didn't have that prefrontal cortex online, and we'll see that tonight, because that's what we're going to do. We're kind of repeating some of the things that we taught earlier in the class, back in lessons probably, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And now we're up to 48. So I wanted to repeat a little bit, because if we're going to learn about emotional relearning, then we need to know a little bit about learning. How is it that we learn? And so it became apparent to me, and you can follow along on page 1, that when we're talking about emotional resilience, we're really dealing with learned behavior. The standard approach to emotional healing for the last probably 30 years has been cognitive in nature. For years, we've taught that when a person has a wrong notion about themselves, they just need to know what is true to correct their thinking. And that works in many cases. If you've got a wrong assumption, sometimes it helps just to realize what the truth is. But as I studied, experimented with my own anxiety and things, and of course worked with many people over the years, I found that there was a different kind of learning, a type of learning that many of the people I was working with experienced. It was learning, it came from trauma. It was reinforced emotionally and tied to that amygdala-based alarm system. I call it emotional learning. And so what are emotions? There's been a whole new field of study. Lisa Feldman Barrett has done a lot of study on the brain, has changed some of the way that we look at the brain. And Sarah McKay, an Oxford University neuroscientist, she's talked about Lisa Feldman, and she was summarizing some of it here. And she said the ingredients of emotions include the physiological sensations that we feel. So there are sensations, and if we can pay attention and we don't escalate so much, we'll know that there's sensations that we feel in our body. Of course, the situation that we're in, right? The situation we're in causes some of that. The people we're with can certainly give an attribute to the emotions we're feeling. The memories, and we'll talk a lot about memories probably next week and the week after, because I believe memories are a big key to why we're reacting the way we do. They're implicit memories, not explicit memories. Implicit meaning they're out of our awareness, but they trigger us. And the good news is we can get in touch with them. And then the language we learn to describe our conscious feeling. And I'd like to add to that the language we haven't learned. We're not describing it accurately a lot of times, and so there's not big change. That's why earlier in the year we talked about increasing our vocabulary when it comes to describing our emotions. Lisa Feldman wrote, an emotion is your brain's creation of what your body's sensations mean in relation to what is going on around you in the world. Remember, the root word of emotions is really to move. Emotions are really sensations in the body before we call them our feelings, and they're there to trigger us, to move us, to get us to move. You hear a loud truck coming down the street, right? And you're not paying attention, all of a sudden you hear, well, you know, that's a sensation in your ear, right? It triggers the brain to say, hey, danger, something's too close, and then you react, right? And so that same mechanism works when we see something that we believe is dangerous. And that belief, a lot of times, is skewed. And we'll get into some more of that. That's the kind of thing. We want to be accurate in what triggers us. And a lot of times we're not. The majority of times we're not. And so what are emotions? And we can look at the middle of the page there. Emotions are made, and this is from Lisa Feldman Barrett. Emotions are made up of ingredients such as your bodily sensations, your life experience, and expectations. And expectations are huge. They're huge. And yet a lot of times those expectations are out of our awareness. And part of what we're going to talk about here in this emotional relearning is getting in touch with some of these things. And then the people you're with and the situation you're in. And then she says, we are the architects of our thinking and behavior. We are also the architects of our emotions. And so the good news there is that we can change. We can change things. Emotions are not reactions to the world. You are not a passive receiver of sensory input, but an active constructor of your emotions. And to me, that gives us hope. That means if we learn something, we can relearn something new. We can be that architect that can change a lot of the ways that we're reacting. From sensory input and past experience, your brain constructs meaning and prescribes actions. And the good news is we can go into that past. And that's where we work with memories. We can go into that past and we can change the meanings. A lot of times the meanings are, I'm no good, something was wrong with me, and these kinds of things. And we can change those meanings. And when we do, then the danger is gone, you might say. The reactions are a lot of times gone. And then you can practice emotions in advance of a situation by teaching your brain the most useful way to respond in a situation. And when we talk about emotional relearning, that's one of the ways. When we start to respond, when we regulate our emotions, we're teaching our brain that it's not that dangerous. And that's a classic way of working on phobias and other things like that in psychology. They'll work on it by repetition and getting used to it, and so there are different practices like that. And she says actors do it all the time. The emotions they feel on stage are real because they rehearsed their creation. And then worry is repeating a thought over and over again. You are practicing that thought. And with practice, it gets easier to experience the thought over time. That's the plasticity of the brain that we'll talk about tonight. Things that fire together, wire together, is old Heb's saying. And there's some real truth to that we get these neuronal pathways going, and so we we practice that thought over and over again, and then it gets easy. And a lot of times we just going right down the pathway. We're not even thinking about it. We don't stop and think. The brain doesn't even need a syllable. It just, and it's gone. It's already there. It doesn't, it's 200 miles an hour. It goes through our system, so it reacts fast. And so we can practice positive thoughts and emotions instead. So that's just some hope. That's some of the latest study in the brain that's been out there. She had a brand new book that I read this year, and I wanted to put some of that in there. So how do we learn? We tend to think of learning only as a logical, rational experience. And that's how we learn in school, right? But the fact is, we learn at least 3 different ways. From birth up through 7 years old, we learn emotionally. From 8 to 11, we learn socially, where others influence what we believe about ourselves, others in the world. And then the rational part of the brain doesn't come online till 12 years old, and that's when we start, and it's developing up to about 22, 23. I've heard different ones. And that's when we start our analytical, logical, emotional thinking, okay? Obviously, we can do math. Kids can memorize. They learn languages. So it isn't that we don't have intelligence. But when it comes to emotionally being rational, that doesn't come online till later. And so the first part is emotional learning. And it doesn't matter so much. We'll get into the brain parts, and you really don't need to learn that it's orbital frontal cortex, but if we look at the prefrontal cortex here, it's in the lower part. And from birth to 7 years old, the lowest part of the prefrontal cortex is the OFC. This part of the brain comes online at birth and is where we emotionally learn. Children in the womb can experience fear. They can experience primitive emotions, if you will. And so we have this emotional capacity, and that's why a lot of times, when there's trauma before childbirth, and the mother's going through trauma, it can affect the neuronal firing of the children, and it can affect a lot of the early learning of the children. A lot of times they do react to trauma. And a person, for example here, let's see. First, it links emotion to expectancy. I underline that, and I think that's important. Expectancy has a lot to do with our emotions. And a lot of times what will help us is if we're sensing that, gee, I'm feeling anxious, what's my expectancy? What am I expecting? What am I dreading? What am I worried about? Worried's a good way to say it, but usually we don't get it. What am I thinking could go wrong? What would go wrong? What am I, and we can get in touch with that sometimes. And the good news is, a lot of times it's just not true. We know that about worry, right? What's the old adage? 90% of what you worry about never will happen, and it's a lot of truth to that. Worry is an emotional mechanism. It's not necessarily based on accurate truth, right? And so first, it links expectancy, emotion to expectancy. And the OFC has learned emotionally how gratifying some things are and how repugnant, fearful, and miserable other things are. And if you don't believe that, try feeding a child peas, or whatever kind of baby food they don't like, right? Maybe your grandchild or child likes peas, but some don't. They'll go, all over. They know they have an emotional reaction to certain things. They know what is repugnant to them, and so fearful. They certainly know what's fearful. I love that classic. We'll have to do that sometime. The video where the little kid, and I've told you before, where the teacher was across the table and playing with these beads, and the child then played with it because it made a lot of noise and it was fun. And then another woman came into the room and sat to the side, and the baby looks at her like, who's this, And it was, I think the baby could have been about 2 years old, I think, something like that. And so it wasn't very old. And so then the woman, and so then they play with the beads again. As soon as the beads do, the woman, then of course this was staged, she goes, oh, what's that? Kind of, what was that? and a real kind of look on the face. Let's not do that, talking about the noise. And so the woman took the beads back, the other woman. So the woman that reacted was here, the woman's here, and the baby's here, right? And so she took the beads back, and the woman's sitting there, and then all of a sudden the woman goes, okay, and she gives the baby back the beads, right? And where earlier the baby's playing with the beads, the baby's there, looking over here, looking back, looking down, looks back at the woman. You couldn't talk that baby into touching those beads, He had learned just from that reaction that danger, Will Robinson, you can't do that. The woman left, and it took a couple turns to retrain that baby that it's going to be safe now to touch the beads. I guarantee you, though, if that woman walked into the room again, the baby would have reacted, That's how we are. And we learn these things, and we start predicting. And it's very possible if that woman kept doing things like that there would have been things about that woman that could have even been similar to other women. And I guarantee you that another woman that looked something like her, or maybe had a facial expression like her, a posture, whatever, would still trigger that baby. That's how it goes to other things. It associates, and that's where we get in trouble a lot of times. That's that kind of learning. And so it also learns, this expectancy causes us to create a plan of action. And with repetition, we learn an emotionally charged belief. The emotion is tied to the belief. Phobias is a reaction, right? I'm going to avoid something, and so we learn to avoid something. We learn to do something else. We learn to protect ourselves in different ways. People pleasers, what have we learned, right? We've learned to say the right things, to do the right, to be subservient, or whatever. And so there's a lot of different modes. I've just been studying that some more, and I'm going to be putting in some of the lessons this year, some of the different kinds of modes that we get into of behavior, and it's really an exciting study, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with us. The OFC is also where we emotionally learn false beliefs about ourselves based on our emotional experience in childhood. A person who is beautiful but feels ugly has learned that emotionally. There's no logic to it. Beliefs like I'm broken goods or I'm unlovable, and trust me, a child doesn't necessarily know those words, but they know the feeling, they know the experience, that shame is in the body, the shame is in the posture, the shame is in, and it may not be verbalized per se, but it's similar things like this that cause shame. They're learned emotionally from reacting to the way people reacted to us. As a child, we have to explain this to ourselves, answering the why. So we do it with childlike logic. And it's powerfully emotionally remembered or learned. The OFC's role is to learn associations between context, location, events, and corresponding adaptive responses, particularly emotional responses. Now, last week, we talked about how emotional learning works. First, there's an emotional experience. Remember, we talked about that. Because it's emotional, it's usually accompanied by an emotional feeling. And so we have an emotional feeling, and that emotional feeling causes an emotional belief, which creates an emotional fear. And then when that fear is realized, it causes an emotional alarm. And so and if you want to see that, if you weren't here, you can pick up lesson 47 and kind of go over that, and we'd be happy to share that with you, okay? In the book Biology of Belief, Dr. Bruce Lipton writes about Dr. Rima Leibau, who did studies on children, and I'll just explain it. He put electrodes to the brain, and he was looking at the brain waves of children. And he said between birth and 2 years of age, the human brain predominantly operates at the lowest frequency, known as delta waves. And though deltas are predominant, babies then exhibit period short bursts of higher, which is at alpha state. And so we find that children are in that theta and alpha state which is significant in that it uses a strong imagination. They use a lot of imagination when they're children. And of course, that's why, right, mud pies are real pies, right? Teddy bears are real people, you know, and so children, and that's probably why I'm so good with my grandchildren. I love imagination, and I can get right into it, you know. And imagination is just something children really, really do a lot of. And that's great, and that's wonderful, except for it can cause a big problem when it comes to explaining why bad things happen. Because we can use that imagination, that imaginative part, and start to believe things about ourselves. Children learn to distinguish what makes their caregivers and siblings pleased and displeased at that early age, and their imagination can amplify the displeasure that a parent exhibits. And in a sense, they're almost in like a hypnotic kind of state. And so they're able to grasp when danger comes, and a lot of times it's exaggerated. I saw this when I was doing play therapy with children. I had I was trained in sandbox therapy, right up my alley. But anyways, we had a sandbox, and we had different toys, and the children are allowed to pick what toys they want, and then they play with them, and we take notes, we watch how they play, and the goal is, are they in concentric circles, and there's a whole theory behind it. But I'll never forget, I was working with this one child that had a lot of issues, and it was playing real well, and then all of a sudden they picked something, it was mama, and something father, and the child, and all of a sudden it's playing, and the child did something wrong, and all of a sudden mama and papa are just yelling at this kid. I mean, this kid's just going, you know, and I'm sitting there going, whoa, you know, that's kind of amplified, right? And I knew the parents, so I'm thinking, there ain't no way, you know, this could be the way the parents react to the child. But what I learned is that, you know, children, we amplify these things. That's because of probably our size, right? Because of our emotional, immaturity, and we amplify these things. And you've seen children do that. They get a little cut in their finger, and there's that one drop of blood. And what do? Some children just go, oh, like they're going to bleed out. You know, they don't know any better. They're just going to bleed out, and you try to calm them down, right? And there's a real over-exaggerated, and they learn, of course, that it wasn't that bad. Mom comforts them or whatever, but there's that possibility. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that amplification stays with us. It's not rational amplification, but it's an emotional amplification. The amygdala it says that it's really dangerous. Our internal alarm doesn't have a wide range of alarms here. An alarm is an alarm. We have to retrain it. And when that fear comes, it's there. It's there. And so it's also when children begin to develop their capacity for understanding their world and how to respond. It can be with resilience, or it can be with the result of poor attachment styles, right? And so the first 6 years of a child's life are fundamentally important. Let's skip down to the exercise for a minute, okay? Because I've been talking a lot, and I want to give you a chance at the tables to talk. Can you think of a time when you or someone you know learned something emotionally that really wasn't true, but was believed as true? For example, maybe you had a time when you thought that, you were, ugly, or that you were no good, or that, you weren't as good as other people, or that someone didn't love you. Or maybe you know someone that has just this, in your opinion, a warped interpretation, but it's real to them. It's extreme, perhaps. Have you ever seen someone that may have learned something negative like that in their childhood? All right, why don't you share at the table for a few minutes? And why don't you come on over here, come on, all right? All right, so take a few minutes and see if there's any talk around the table. If you're new here, you certainly don't have to participate. You can just say pass or just watch. All right, take about one more minute. All right, let's go ahead and continue, okay? We're going to continue on the emotional learning. And the significant part of this is that what we need to know is a lot of times we're reacting certain ways, and we haven't really gotten in touch with it. And it's pretty safe to believe that if we can't figure it out right away, that it's probably coming from some time when we were younger. And chances are when we were real young, and it's stuck with us. That part hasn't been retaught yet. It hasn't relearned, and so we're reacting. And a lot of times, and it takes some work to get in touch with that. But let's look at the page 3 at the top. The first 6 years of a child's life are fundamentally important. Children learn more quickly during their early years than any other time in life. They are at the height of emotional learning. This is the foundation that shapes children's future beliefs about themselves, others, and life in general. Now, that could have came out of a 1960 psychology book, because we believed back then that, that was it. You know, most of your personality was developed by the age of 4 or whatever, your what you believed about life and yourself, and it was put in cement. But we know today, now that, it took a long time for scientists to really start believing in the plasticity of the brain that we'll talk about in a few minutes, the fact that it can change. And we know as a fact today that there's hope, that we can change. Now, we've known that in the church for a long time, right? We've read in Romans 12 where it constantly says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? We've believed in the spiritual ability to be transformed, to change. At least I've been preaching it all my life. But I never had the psychological evidence that they do today to show that we can make these significant changes in what we believe about ourselves and about life and what we actually end up feeling about ourselves. And so there is hope today, and I usually have you tell each other that. So why don't you just tell, in case I forgot, tell the person next to you, there's hope today, all right? Come on. All right. Half of you said it like you believed it. Let's try that again. Come on now, give me a hope. There's hope. All right, there we go. All right, that's not bad. All right, so in the first 6 years then we have that they need love and nurturing to develop a sense of trust and security that creates a positive self-image and promotes self-love as they grow up. I'm reading an award-winning book right now on childhood development that's really been really fascinating, and as I grind it up and chew it, I'll be putting some of that into our new year. But I'm really excited about some of the studies that have been going on and how we learn and how we can relearn. And so what we know is that we're the height of emotional learning. This is foundation that shapes children's future beliefs about themselves, like we said. Now, they need love and nurturing to develop a sense of trust and security that creates a positive self-image and promotes self-love as they grow up. Otherwise, being in this theta state of suggestibility, almost like a hypnotic state, right, leaves them open to misinterpretation of who they are and their intrinsic goodness. The children are very suggestible, and if you know that, if you've had children, and they, you can trick them, and do stuff. You might say they're gullible, maybe would be another word, but that children trust, right? And they can a lot of times believe stuff about themselves. It's hard for a child to ever think that it's someone else's fault as far as a parent's concerned, authorities are concerned. They can point to a sibling, and they can do stuff like that. But when it's an authority figure, someone that's a caregiver, there's such a bond, it's hard to ever think that it could be theirs. It has to be my fault. And so we a lot of times get meaning. The massive amount of learning that occurs in childhood is primarily learned emotionally and is believed emotionally without the benefit of an integrated system that includes rational reasoning. The analytical, rational part of the brain, which is essential for behavioral self-regulation, develops later after early childhood. At this age, all children have difficulty with change, thinking outside the current moment, and delaying rewards or gratification. That is why children have difficulty stopping one activity and switching to a new one, planning ahead, doing more than one thing at a time, concentrating for long periods, and foregoing immediate rewards. This can be frustrating to parents and result in behavior and comments that are not conducive to a child's healthy self-esteem. I'll give you an example here. While shopping, a child asks for a toy. The mother's busy and says no. And she has her own reasons. Could be financially. The children's got a closet full of toys, just got one, who knows. After a minute, does the child give up? No. The child asks again for a toy again. The mother, frustrated, uses a louder, more stern voice. No, you can't have one. Of course, she's busy. She's got other kids, right? They're fighting or doing whatever, right? The child is quiet, but after a few minutes, they pass the toy department, darn that Walmart, right? And the child starts to cry and loudly, I want a toy. Well, the mother is truly frustrated at this point and remembers an early event in which the child acted inappropriately and says, no, you don't deserve a toy. The mother may or may have not have really meant that, but now the child emotionally internalizes the look, tone of voice, and the raw statement as, I do not deserve things. The tone of voice, the look of the mother's face, and the sad feelings they experience when their desire is not immediately satisfied are registered in the immature brain as distressing or disturbing. Now, I'll say it on the next page, but let me say it now. One instance isn't going to warp a child for life, okay? But parents, we can become habitual. We know what works and what doesn't work. And even though we may not mean it and don't think that sometimes, putting down a child like that, that kind of stuff, you don't deserve, you this and that, that kind of stuff over time can really start influencing a child's self-belief. Now, in the example above, the child wanted the toy, and in their immature emotional thinking, they should have gotten it. Although young children struggle with delaying gratification, the mother's consistently saying no with the right tone of voice and explanation could help the child know that now is not the time for a toy. However, when the mother's frustration, the shearing way in which the mother said you do not deserve a toy, and no correction or the over-emotional reaction or soothing of the child leaves the child alone to interpret what's going on. Because of the highly imaginative state of mind in childhood, our emotional brains create stories to make sense of the world around us. In the above scenario, a child could easily emotionally exaggerate, even misinterpret the incident and create a false meaning, such as believing they are unworthy of a toy or even love for that matter. And so then I asked you the question, and we did the exercise. Well, what happens then is a lot of times we end up with some of these feelings. It's the roots of social anxiety, for example. We may have certain feelings and emotions, and now we move into the social learning. We're getting ready to go meet with other children, right? We're getting ready to go to school, and we start hearing things from other children. I'm amazed as my grandchildren tell me about some of the discussions they're having with other kids, and it's crazy how influenced they are by other children, and the talk that goes on. Social learning is the middle part of the cortex, and it goes on from ages 8 to 11. This is the seat of the social brain. It's where we socially learn. This is where we develop our sense of self and others, both cognitively and emotionally. This learning comes online in middle school, where it encodes all types of social knowledge. Now, I watch my grandchildren. I have one particular child that's in this age and has some body shaming stuff going on already. And the expectancy that she has when she goes into a room, the expectancy about her own looks has already been warped. And I'm working really hard on trying to help that and be more positive. And I had just some great times with her this last weekend. But you can see the little bits of things that goes on. The author on page 4 here, Bill O'Hannon, shared in the presentation I watched on being good enough about how a child goes from emotional learning to social learning. He said a child, when they are 3, will choose a nickel over a dime. When they are 8, they will pick a dime over a nickel. And so they learn the difference. You know, the emotional thing, bigger is better, right? When they're young, nickel's bigger than the dime, so, you know, it has to be more valuable. There's an emotional weight to that. Later, they learn that there's a social context to more money, and so they realize that a dime is more valuable than a nickel. Now, in this developmental period, they start to realize what others feel is valuable, and they start adjusting their own beliefs and concepts accordingly. This is the age where our insecurities become more amplified. Now, if you were shamed at home, you know, siblings aren't always the kindest, right? And, you know, if you had some issues, if certain comments were made at home and things like that, and now you go to school, that's going to a lot of times be reinforced. And it's uncanny how other children can just find out what we're insecure about. It's like blood in the water for a shark. They just know. They're able to hone in what makes other children feel insecure. And a bully can magnify right to that. And a lot of times it's because they communicate in their posture, they communicate in their facial expression, you know, the walk of shame or whatever. And so, in this case, in the case of the child asking for a toy, it resulted in the mother getting mad and saying, "You do not deserve a toy." Now, of course, a semi-dramatic incident does not program a child to believe things about themselves for the rest of their life. But repeated similar episodes without correction from the caregiver, that rupture repair, right, can lead a child to internalize negative beliefs about themselves and others. And too often we end up reinforcing our negative beliefs from childhood. We take what we learn at home and test it in the outside world. Unfortunately, our expectations often color what we see and experience. We develop a negativity bias, and we've talked about that a lot in here, where our brain picks up, you know, watches for the things that we believe somehow are dangerous to us, and we have that negative. We're going to look for that more than we're going to look for the good. You ever do that? You've done real good at something, you feel good about it, and 10 people tell you how good you did, and then that one person comes and tells you they didn't like it. What do you ruminate on for the rest of the day? Huh? The 10 people that said it was good, or the one person that said it was bad, right? Now, not everyone does that. I wish I wasn't one, but that can tend to, you know, get to me, right? Because of this negativity bias that we have sometimes. And it's hard to accept the positive things. And so a lot of times we're looking for it. And when a child's young socially, they're starting to look. It causes them to jump to the conclusion. They watch for other similar incidents, include continuing to build a case that substantiates the original negative story and developing beliefs. Now, you would think a child would want to believe that there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, we're thinking that because we're more rational, right? But this falls under the heading, you might say, learned helplessness, right? Once a child starts believing something negative, it doesn't really become much of an option to them. They have to learn it. They have to learn it. And so what happens here is that it's in there and they're looking for things. The emotional meaning and interpretations will stick with them until their rational brain processes create an updated meaning with mature understanding. And that's what emotional relearning is. We want to learn some of these things. So part of your homework in the next couple of weeks is going to be, what are some of the things you're believing? Keep it a little emotional journal for the next couple of weeks. When you feel an emotion coming on, even if it's at the end of the night and you think back through the day, you know, why was I thinking that way? What caused it? What could have happened that made me feel that sense of sad, where I teared up? And then the key question, what was I believing about them or about the situation, but specifically about me? And you'll be surprised if you can sit there. And spiritually, you can ask the Lord to help you with some insights. But as we start learning these and we can start identifying some of these emotional beliefs that are behind some of our mood swings or emotional episodes, we can start to challenge them. We can start to challenge them. We're not going to die because we get in touch with the fact that I feel I'm ugly or I feel I'm no good. Will we tear up? Perhaps. Who wants to believe that, right? But we'll live through that. What we won't live through is never correcting it, because it's just going to keep with us and it's going to cause all kinds of problems and triggers. So you'd have nothing to fear getting in touch with some of these things, okay? You want to be your own detective. So go out and get a Sherlock Holmes hat, and a little magnifying glass, and start being your own detective, okay? And start finding out some of these things. So, for example, and I use this one a lot, a child from early childhood home was made to feel inferior or not good enough will carry with them that at school. Now, it may not be about everything, but it may be about certain things. It may be when they first meet someone new. It may not be when it comes to language. It may not be when it comes to sports, but maybe it comes to conversation or when it comes to certain things, right? Or it could be sports again, whatever. They know when they're in a situation that they don't feel comfortable in. And so as they walk the halls with a sense of shame or inferiority, they become an easy target for those who want to bully and put down others. Soon they learn who the socially acceptable children are. So when they walk down the hall and they see a socially acceptable child looking their direction and laughing, who do you think they think the child was laughing at? Of course, them. And if you think about it, you've probably made those kind of assumptions yourself. And right then, that's being socially reinforced. Kid was probably laughing at a joke someone else said. Who knows? It could have been a million things. But right then, without any substantiation, that child was reinforced, there's something wrong with me. And this happens over and over and over and over again. And it's in the background. It isn't like we're even noticing it sometimes. We're just in the funk. And the mind's just reinforcing it, right? And so that's social learning. And it's being socially reinforced. It's in the social context that our core self-beliefs create self-regulation issues. We develop personal perspectives and prejudices, trying to connect with those we love or admire and distancing ourselves from those that cause us pain or we distrust. We come up with our sense of self by age 8 or 9. This is emotionally learned, but in some cases can be highly inaccurate. Our understanding of self then, whether accurate or inaccurate, becomes a self-definition that's cemented into place by repetitive experiences that reinforce and deepen these self-beliefs. Now, for some of you, this is the first time you're reading this, circle that paragraph, reread it a couple times. I've read it a couple times. Reread it and get the significance of that, because this is how this learning has taken place. And the brain plasticity is what allows these negative beliefs to be reinforced and put in a network. The good news is brain plasticity can also allow us to make changes. The brain is constantly learning. Therefore, our sense of self can remain the same or can be modified and reconfigured by the repetition of experience with immense social and emotional meaning. It could be negative, such as in drug use, antisocial behavior, or negative peer pressure, which takes us on a downward spiral, or it can be positive through love, spiritual experiences, and positive peer pressures. We actually know that childhood trauma and that really affects the brain. There's a dysregulation going on. And many of the people I've counseled over the years that have come to me that maybe are in addictions and that, it's amazing how many say they started it around 10 years old. Oh, I took my first hit when I was 10, or I drank my first. And a lot of times they'll say this, I felt normal for the first time. There was like this, why? Because alcohol works with all 5 major neurotransmitters in the brain. Cigarettes work with 3. Drugs, of course, work, and what? It's working with the neurotransmitters. Where there was a dysregulation, it upregulates it, and it works for a while. But then we know the trouble with the rebound effect and everything else. But that's why, and it's because of this dysregulation that went on, these negative beliefs. And so we find that a lot of children find escapes through addictions and other things in early childhood, and it's becoming younger and younger and more prevalent. So here's the good news, though. This part of the brain that comes alive when we imagine, daydream, and rehearse possible interactions with others. That part of the brain comes alive, that same part of the brain. So we can use that, right, to use imagination and rehearse possible interactions with others. It's where we can make corrections to past negative self-beliefs and traits. We can emotionally relearn. So let's do this exercise, all right? Can you think of a time when you or someone you know learned something socially or cemented it in? And maybe you already felt bad, but at school you remember when you were humiliated. You remember when all of a sudden you really started thinking, well, gee, I look this way, or I feel this way, or I don't belong in this group. And it just kind of really stuck with you. And hopefully the Lord's changed that in you. Maybe he hasn't. But there's still hope. We can change. But was there something that you really wasn't true, but you believed it as true? Go ahead and see if there's something at the table you guys can share about that. All right, take about one more minute. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. It's a little after 8. We got refreshments in the back over there. Bathrooms are around the corner. So let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, come back at 7 after, and we'll finish up here. Now? There we go. Okay. Must have been stuck. Sorry about that. Well, all right. So anyways, let's look at page 6 then, neuroplasticity, okay? The key to learning and relearning. And we talked about Hebb earlier, where he came up with the saying that, things that wire together, fire together. We know today that there's actually more parts of the brain working in relationship than just segments of the brain. We tended earlier, the neuroscientists tended to early on put different parts of the brain to different functions, and then we started looking at the way the brain lights up, and so pathways were created. But even now, today, they're changing some of that too, saying that's a more holistic kind of brain. But the plasticity of the brain means that things can change, and we know that it works in different parts of the brains. With stroke victims, for example, a part of the brain that dies, other part of the brain then compensates for it. And what happens, though, is sometimes it crowds out other functioning, but it's amazing how the neuroplasticity can work. It refers to the brain's, I'm in like the third paragraph's, ability to change and adapt as a result of experience. The term neuro refers to neurons and the nerve cells that are building blocks of the brain and nervous system. Plasticity refers to the brain's malleability, right? The ability to change. Neuroplasticity or brain plasticity is the brain's ability to change throughout life. The human brain has amazing ability to reorganize itself by forming new connections between brain cells, neurons, and it occurs in the brain at the beginning of life, right? When the immature brain organizes itself, and it's amazing, man. The kids or babies are just like sponges, right? And then there's a big pruning that comes after that, and then in the case of a brain injury, to compensate for lost functions or maximize remaining functions, there's a whole bunch of neuroplasticity going on. And then throughout adulthood, whenever something new is learned or memorized even, and so the older you get, the more they tell you to do different kinds of brain exercises and things like that to keep the neurons firing and to grow new neurons. Now, it's the learning that can cause us trouble, though. What if we learn something wrong? Then these ideas, beliefs, and behaviors can dramatically affect our future. A good example is how the limbic system works. The limbic system is integral to emotional resilience, and it's there to help us. And that's great when we step into a street and a truck's coming down a highway. Our brain would hear the noise of the oncoming truck. Our amygdala would react, causing us to move out of harm's way. And we'd remember that, and that plasticity of the brain would help us remember that kind of stuff. But what if it was a wrong association? What if we learned somehow, maybe by an over-exaggeration, don't go near the street, or whatever, or your uncle died, he got hit by a car. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that we think children aren't paying attention to, but they can, and that story's repeated, and so somehow perhaps the child picks up somewhere that you can't even go near the street. What if they were frozen by fear of a car blocks away and afraid to move? This is a case where there's an overprotective amygdala working on an exaggerated association. The false belief would be that any noise we hear at a busy street means danger and we cannot cross safely. Likewise, how many beliefs about ourselves, others in life, keep us from living the way we were meant to live? False beliefs created false alarms. And that's where the hope comes from. If you find that you're over-emoting to a situation, chances are a large majority of times you're reacting to something that's just a childhood learning experience. That's not true. There's not real danger. It's false alarm built on faulty wiring. And you know what? It's better to believe that and find out that's true than keep assuming that there's something wrong. And we need to really start believing that. One of the things that stops people from learning, from changing the most, is that they don't put enough time into the practice of new thinking, new kinds of thinking. The brain does it. Most of the studies, whether it's been chronic pain that I've studied, addictions I've studied, I look for these things, and it's amazing. Even the guy I'm going to quote here for 6 months seems to be something I hear a lot of, and it takes that repetitive to do it. We've taken a lifetime to learn, and so we need to put ourselves in learning. So that's why this class is a year long. You only get it once a week, but I'm going to push harder and harder for people to re-listen to the videos, keep reading, study, and really learn this stuff. Because I've seen enough people change in marvelous ways because of what they're learning here. And as we put the time into it, we will change our brain. And then you add the spiritual, my goodness. You know, you add what God can do in our life together with this, He can change. And it's just an amazing, amazing thing. And so, using the plasticity of the brain to help us emotionally, I've studied a lot about chronic pain. And acute pain comes from the body up to the brain. Chronic pain is actually a phenomenon of the brain going down into the body. And it's amazing how a lot of times the plasticity to the brain, when you have an acute pain, it takes there's about, I think, 16 or 18 different areas in the brain that register it. And it takes about 5% of the neuronal territory in each one of those areas. Once chronic pain takes effect, it's taking up about 25% of the neuronal territory in those areas. It's been learned. It's been learned. And it's hard to tell people that because the pain is real. It's not a false pain. It's real pain. And anyone that has chronic pain will tell you that. And I don't want to be within standing distance where they can kick me when I say this kind of stuff because I'm not insinuating it's not real pain. It's real pain. But a lot of studies and more studies are coming. And I'll be sharing a lot this year because I'm in a group of people that are studying this real hard, and I really want to see people get help with chronic pain. But let's look at this one here. Michael Mockowitz on page 7. I've met with his associate who wrote the book with him. I've met her in Florida, and we talked about this, but he's a leading expert on neuroplasticity, and he and the co-author, Dr. Goldman, who I met, wrote in their book, Neuroplastic Transformation, Your Brain on Pain, How Neuroplasticity Can Change Back the Brain from Trauma-Induced Limbic Impairment. Now, look at bottom of 6 first. I skipped that, sorry. Annie Hopper is another one. Now, she doesn't work with chronic pain. She works with chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic chemical sensitivity. I'll never forget the first time I met someone that was having, I've met quite a few with chronic fatigue, and it's hard to deal with. It's a hard one, but chemical sensitive, this person had aluminum foil all on the inside of the room. They pulled the carpets out of the house. I mean, it was just, if you've ever had an allergy and you've seen it get worse, that's what happens, right? It's an overactivation of the amygdala. Well, she has put together a program that's really helped a lot of people, and she's one of the ones that said 6 months. Michael Mockowitz here talks about 6 months. But anyway, she says on the bottom of 6, the adaptive property of neuroplasticity can be used in a positive way. Trauma can result in a limbic system impairment. Now, that could be a chemical trauma, right? And now, all of a sudden, now it's more allergic to all kinds of chemicals, right? And you'll notice that if you've ever had allergies, how it gets more sensitive. The good news is that we can learn how to become aware of the unconscious reactions. Now, my parentheses, that's what I call emotional recognition. Learn to consciously interrupt a negative limbic reaction. That's what I call emotional regulation. And eventually rewire the brain back to normal functioning. That's what I call emotional relearning. So I thought it was kind of cool. Now, Michael Mockowitz, like I said up top, look what he says. He says, your brain changes automatically, I'm in the second paragraph, instantly, efficiently, seamlessly, and constantly in response to changes in your body. The messengers are our senses, thoughts, beliefs, memories, emotions, and movement. It also changes in response to injuries, disease, traumatic events, and stressful situations, and that's what we're talking about. The changes we see can be positive or negative. Most of us don't realize it, but we are actually training our brains every time we learn a new skill, such as reading, typing, singing a song, learning a dance, or riding a bike. It is through repetition, practice, creativity, and improvement that we master any activity. This happens through electrical and chemical signals in our cells, creating pathways in our brains that allow us to perform these tasks. We are literally changing the anatomy of our brains. By being aware of this YF process, what in the world? I don't know, my fingers went nuts. But anyways, aware of this process, we can consciously utilize it to our benefit. And this is the paragraph I love here. Neuroplastic transformation is the treatment that uses the basic principles of neuroplasticity to change brain pathways back to normal function and anatomy. To accomplish this, we use thoughts, images, sensations, memories, soothing emotions, movements, and beliefs to harness the power of our brains. And so by learning principles of how our brain works, we can begin to use conscious part of our brains to modify the experience of our lives. Now, that was written in 2013. I didn't get the book probably till around 15 or so. The good news, we had already been teaching this for 8 years up at that point. And then all of a sudden, he's coming out and saying the method is to change our thoughts. So when we do different kinds of thinking, when we use our imagination, right, we start seeing things different, our sensations, when we start to regulate our emotions, our memories, when we work with our memories, when we use, soothing emotions, otherwise regulate, right, and relaxing and stuff like that, and movement. We'll talk about that later, and then not today, and beliefs. Those are how we do this, what's called neurostimulation, how we can change the brain. And here again, in Christendom, we've been teaching that forever, right? And so we've always, prayer, meditation, things like that. There's a lot that we can do that will help. He's saying that we change our brain through plasticity using neurostimulation, and this neurostimulation can happen through the use of our thoughts, images, sensations, memories, soothing emotions, movement, beliefs. We are told over and over again throughout the Bible that our thoughts, heart, imagination, memories, emotions, and beliefs help us live the way we should. And so the good news is that the same plasticity of the brain that helped us learn negative things can also help us relearn positive, right? Our thoughts, emotions, and actions are a combination of what we believe, assume, perceive, predict, and feel. These are influenced by our experiences, learning, physiology, spirituality, and relationships. Our past has helped us create the way we believe, assume, perceive, predict, and feel. Again, that's a lot of talk there. Circle it, read it, think it, pray over it, get it, okay? It will change your life when you start to see there's hope today. And you're not alone. You're not alone. And there's hope today, and we will change, okay? And so that all these things help us the way we live, that we should. The good news is the same plasticity of brain that helped us learn can help us relearn, right? And so Dr. Feldman Barrett, in her book, How Emotions Are Made, quotes Dr. Gerald Edelman as coining this phenomena as our remembered past. But just because it's our remembered past doesn't mean that we attributed correct meaning to it. What if our beliefs, assumptions, and perceptions were wrong? False assumptions and beliefs and perceptions could be leading us down a wrong road. The good news, we can change what we believe, assume, and the meaning, okay? And so there's 3 different things, actually 4. I didn't change that. There's 4 different degrees of emotional relearning, at least, okay? And what I called emotional relearning is the practice of correcting a lie about ourselves by learning the truth emotionally. It's a combination of a bodily reaction, a cognitive shift, an emotional aha, and spiritual truth I've added. The bodily reaction, for some emotional reactions to trigger, simply calming ourselves and having a different reaction over and over till it is a state of mind will be enough to be a relearning experience, at least to that particular trigger, okay, to that particular trigger. The trouble is in some of the psychology where they use exposure therapy, a rape victim, and so they'll have them think of the experience over and over and over again, and until they finally don't have the horrific reaction. What they found is that works, but what they've done really in reality there is created a new memory. And they haven't extinguished all the triggers. And so a lot of times a person that's been through that can still have a horrific reaction later when another trigger is introduced that wasn't maybe really thought through in the first time. So it's more than just rehearsing, but a lot of times if we can start to have different reactions to the stimulus, right, to the thing that's bothering us, if we can learn to calm down, that's what happens in panic attacks, right? I mean, panic attacks, we don't know why this is happening. How, oh my gosh, I'm just going over. But we learn to relax, we ride the wave, and pretty soon we're able to extinguish that. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again. Then there's that cognitive shift. For some, learning what the lie is and that they were believing and finding out what the truth is through personal insight is enough to be an emotional relearning. This is especially true to the answers of why something traumatic happened. You'd be surprised in counseling how many times the person is troubled because something horrific happened, and deep down they believed it was their fault. And it takes weeks a lot of times and more to get them to that place where they admit that, because it's such a deep, paralyzing kind of thought and guilt that's going on. But once they see that, and you can show them that in many cases it's not true, right? It's not true. It can really cause a cognitive shift. It can really become. And so when we realize new truth, and it comes from a reliable source, a credible source, it comes with emotional impact, it can be an emotional relearning. And so that will be some of the things. And then that emotional aha, one that I feel is most comprehensive, has the most lasting result. It involves getting as close as possible to the initial learning and go into the memory and ascertain the truth. It is correcting the childish belief and bringing comfort and closure to that very child that is, in a way, still alive in us. It's a maturing realization that brings bodily, cognitive, and emotional closure to the triggering experience. And then the last one, what I've found over the years, is a spiritual truth. This is similar to an emotional aha, except we know it is coming from a personal, loving God who cares for us and is the final authority. It is the truth that sets us free that Jesus was talking about. It's the confidence that Paul talks about when he says, I know that I know that I know. That knowledge in the Bible always refers to experiential knowledge. And so I know this to be true. It's a peace also that Paul talks about. It's a peace that passes our own understanding. And so when we learn the truth spiritually, along with these other things, it really, really becomes a new emotional learning. And that's where we're going in the next 2 weeks. We're going to continue and talk more about it. So the lie was emotionally learned. It feels true, not due to the logic of the belief, but due to the enormous emotion it carried with it. And so we counter the wrong belief with a source of truth that is credible enough to believe, powerful enough to overcome the source of the lie. And when a credible source corrects the awful lie that we believe about ourselves and authoritatively shares the truth with us, it's a moving experience. It's liberating. It's exhilarating. So that's where we're heading, okay? And that's what we want to learn more about. How can we emotionally know the truth? But what I encourage you to do now is start to examine yourself and your experiences and start asking, what am I believing? What am I thinking? What am I believing about the situation? What am I believing about the consequences? What am I believing might happen to me? Whatever it is. And don't put yourself down about it. Just write it. And then we're going to start looking at some of these, okay? All right. Let's go ahead and we'll just commit this to the Lord then. Father, there's a lot tonight about this. I thank you, Lord, that we've been able to learn so much about how we work, how we operate. And I thank you, Lord, that indeed there is hope today. I remember 50 years ago, Lord, when, I was in so much, and 40 years ago, Lord, for that long period of time when anxiety just was crippling me so much. And Lord, the things that I believed about myself and wasn't even really fully aware. And Lord, how that feeling of being unlovable, Lord, and inadequate. And Lord, how you in your mercy through others and yourself over time have been teaching me to believe the truth. And I thank you for that, Lord. And I pray for each of us here that indeed truth will set us free. That, Lord, we'll start to recognize where some of the roots of this is. And, Lord, that we'll start to relearn emotionally what the truth is. So help us in these next couple weeks as we go more into it. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks so much. Next week we'll continue on this, all right? So thanks. All right, good job. Good job.